And I really doubted that that was going to happen. I was kind of thinking, okay, this is my life for the rest of my life. The first and
Mm.
last thing I think about are going to be my son's heart defect. And I can honestly tell you, Margaret, that that's not the case.
Mm. Well, thank you so much, Anna, for joining me.
I'm so excited to be here, Margaret. Thank you for having me on your program.
Yeah. So we're just going to go ahead and get started with the first question, which is, could you tell me a little bit more about your son and his diagnosis?
Sure. When my son was first diagnosed, it was after 2 months of my husband and me saying something was wrong, and us being told that we were overprotective parents and not to compare him to our older son. He was having feeding problems. He was jaundiced, but never jaundiced enough to go under the Billy lights. And so finally, at his 2 month well baby checkup, the doctor told me she was admitting him.
Mm, that must have been terrifying.
It was. It was. We had been saying for 2 months that something was wrong. I saw 3 different lactation consultants because he would start nursing and fall asleep on me, and I couldn't keep him awake long enough to have a good feed. And so I was being told for 2 months that something was in my head, that nothing was wrong with my baby, and I needed to just change the way that I was holding him when I fed him, or take all his clothes off and put a cold washcloth on his chest, and then he would nurse longer. And I did everything, but I was having to set an alarm every 3 hours because he never woke up crying. Even if he had a dirty diaper, he never cried. Everybody would think that's a perfect baby, right?
Mm,
But I knew something was wrong. And so finally, at his 2 month well baby checkup, she said she was admitting him. I asked her how she could admit him when for 2 months they had told us that he was fine. But I had said something to her that made her decide to admit him. I went through the same litany of he's not nursing, he doesn't wake up crying, he never cries, except for when I put the cold washcloth on his body to wake him up to make him nurse longer. Then he
right.
would cry. But and then I was worried he was sleeping so much. And then I said, yesterday he woke me up. And she said, "Oh, really?" And I said, "Yeah, but he wasn't crying. He was grunting." And
Mm,
that's when she stopped everything, listened to him again, took all his clothes off again and listened to him. And then she said, "We're admitting him." And when I
mm,
pressed her on how she could admit him when they kept telling us that he was fine, she said, "Oh, well, I'm admitting him for failure to thrive."
hmm.
For me, that was like a stab in the heart. Failure to thrive babies were babies who weren't loved. Not my
Mm,
baby. I
right.
was setting an alarm every 3 hours. I was force feeding him. I was keeping a log of every dirty and wet diaper. I was
Mm,
putting him in the window for a sunbath after every feeding when the sun was out to try and get rid of the jaundice.
mm,
That wasn't my baby. And then she said, "Well, failure to thrive can also be babies who are critically ill." Now,
mm,
my baby had never had a temperature, had never vomited, had never had diarrhea. I
mm.
said, "How can you say he's critically ill?" And she said, "Well, I think he has cystic fibrosis." So thankfully, a very observant nurse watched the way he was breathing, which was another complaint we had had almost from the moment he was born.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, "Well, what did the x ray say?" And I said, "We haven't had an x ray." And she said, "What?" So the next thing I knew, the resident was ordering an x ray, and the x ray revealed an extremely enlarged heart. They weren't prepared to deal with that at that hospital. So within a very short period of time, Alexander and I were in an ambulance whizzing down the highway to San Antonio, Texas, where we were told that he had a critical congenital heart defect and he needed open heart surgery immediately, or we could do nothing.
Wow. Wow. And I'm assuming it was a no-brainer. You were like, no, we're going to go through with the surgery.
It was a no brainer for me, but 3 of my son's doctors recommended that we take him home
Did they
because
give
he was in congestive heart failure by that point. and they really didn't think he had a good chance to survive. In fact, the surgeon said he had a 5% chance to survive the surgery.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they really were not holding out much hope for us at all,
Mm,
Margaret. It was really heartbreaking. Now,
mm,
finally, somebody was listening to my husband and me that something was wrong. We knew what was wrong. We knew it was the heart, but then the next thing we know, they're all telling us, the cardiologist, the surgeon, and there was a whole room full of people. There was another doctor who was an attending, and they all recommended that we take Alex home for what they called compassionate care, which
mm.
didn't feel compassionate to me.
Right. And so you went through with the surgery, and how's he doing now?
He's 26 years old, he works a full-time job, and he's doing great.
That's amazing. That's so
It
great.
really, Margaret, it's a miracle.
Mm.
It's a miracle. So are you, for that matter. You heart warriors, you guys are a tough breed.
Yes. Yes. I think we just have those life experiences that make it impossible not to be a tough breed when it comes
Mm,
to certain things, and other things, I break down about. But yeah.
yeah, I hear you. I hear you. And it's a double-edged sword because he is a very tough heart warrior. He doesn't like
Mm,
the term heart warrior. He doesn't like for his heart defect to define him.
mm,
To him, that's just like me having brown eyes. It's just part of who he is, but it's not all of who he is. And he really wants to be remembered and to be known for the things that he does with his life, not for the condition that he was born with.
definitely. So, how many years was it before you decided to start a podcast for the CHD community?
It's so funny. You act like this was something I chose to do. It's actually something that kind of fell in my lap. And the term podcast wasn't even being used when I first got started. So that's how old I am. So what happened first was I had always wanted to be a writer. That was a lifelong dream of mine, just like it is. Apparently, it was with you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started writing. Now, the very first book I wrote, which was published, was called Hypoplastic Left Heart Syndrome, A Handbook for Parents. It actually got reviewed in Library Journal twice. And
Ah.
so the book was actually in libraries, and some people did know about it, even though it was so specialized, hypoplastic left heart syndrome. But at this point, I had been writing in parenting magazines. I wrote for a little local newspaper. And in fact, I was contributing so much that they didn't want the newspaper to look like I was their only writer. So some of the things had a byline and some of the things did not. And I
Mm-hmm.
was fine with that. I was just trying to help out and provide material for them. So I had to put together a, a CV with everything that I had ever done, right?
Okay.
And I didn't realize I did so much until I realized I had written for Heart newsletters, and she said everything. So I put this all together and I told my webmaster, if I'm working this hard to put this all together, I should publish it on the internet, right? And then maybe that way I could get some more writing gigs or I could get some more speaking gigs. So she said, okay. And she put up everything that I had done
Mm.
and on the About Anna page.
Okay.
Everything was up there. And so years later, I get a phone call from somebody who had been reading my blog. And he said, hey, I was looking at your blog and I wondered, have you ever thought about having your own radio show? Now,
Mm.
by this point, I had been on several radio shows talking about congenital heart defect awareness day and, lots of different things, but I had never considered having my own radio show.
Mm-hmm.
And so he said, well, if you were going to have a radio show, what would you talk about today? I said, well, that's easy. I would talk about what I had written about in my blog. And he said, well, what if you were doing one next week? And so he was just peppering me with questions like this. And so I did a good enough job answering his questions that he said, I think you should have your own radio show. He said, if you would like to do this, why don't you put together a plan and I'll present it to my general manager and we'll see what happens. my friend Mary sat down with me. We thought out 13, I had to have enough information for 13 episodes. So we thought out 13 different episodes. You know what? As I started doing it, it started to become really fun. And I started thinking of all of these friends who I would love to have come on the show and talk about different things. And so that's how Heart to Heart with Anna was born. I was told I was having my own radio show.
Okay, so it started as a radio show and then it morphed eventually when technology kind of picked up and podcasts became a thing. You kind of moved into that world?
Nope, it was always a podcast. We just weren't using the word podcast in 2013.
Oh, okay.
It was always a podcast, but I couldn't afford to stay with them. He offered me this show, and I thought I was going to be doing something for Voice America, but it was a way for Voice America to make money off of me.
Ah.
And I actually saw it as a sign from God. I know that might sound kind of corny, but I was a writer and I was having difficulty getting the word out about my books. I'm sure you can relate as a writer. I think PR and marketing is the hardest part of what we do, don't you?
Definitely.
So when Josh asked me, do you want to do this? He said, this would be a great way for you to sell your books. And I saw it as an investment in my publishing company. So that's why I did it. So after that, I decided this is too important. I was loving what I was doing and I didn't want to stop. And I found out about Blog Talk Radio.
Okay.
So I went over to Blog Talk Radio and started doing my show that way because there was a studio. See, with Voice America, they provided the studio and the sound engineers, and they did my promotion. I mean, I was treated like a queen with Voice America. Now, Blog Talk Radio, it's all on me. I had to learn how to sound engineer my own shows. I had to do my own promotion. Thank goodness for Callie Rickard. She was a heart mom who was helping me at that time, and she did a lot of the promotional stuff for me, which was a blessing. And so I learned how to do everything on my own. I also found out about podcast movement. This is when I realized I was doing a podcast, Margaret.
There you go.
Yeah, before that I thought it was, just internet radio. So internet radio, podcast, pretty much synonymous. I just didn't know it at the time. And going to podcast movement was huge for me. It really opened my eyes to what podcasting was all about. I found out I wasn't alone. I wasn't the only one who was nervous and scared and wondering how I was going to do this. And so all of a sudden I had this whole other community who was helping me, and it was really, really amazing. And I've never looked back since.
Yeah. Oh, your podcast brings so many people together and lets them know that they're not alone, and that's what it's all about when you're sharing other people's stories. It's so nice.
Thank you. I love it. I love hearing people's stories. Everybody has a story. Some people have lots of stories and I have to have them come back. And that's always a lot of fun to go a little bit deeper or to find some other subject that they're really passionate about.
Yeah. So jumping off of everything that you've talked about with your podcast, I wanted to know if there was one thing an interviewee on your podcast has said that stuck with you.
Well, there are a lot of things that people have said that stuck with me. It'll be interesting. I'll be washing dishes or I'll be mowing the grass or something like that, and parts of the podcast will replay in my mind some of the things that people have said because I have such brilliant people on my show, Margaret. I don't know that there's any, it's funny, I don't know that there's any one thing necessarily that comes to mind. It's more like I'll be thinking of something and then I'll think, oh yeah, I remember when Margaret said that. It's like things that people say will come back, and or I'll find even deeper meaning in what they say when I start talking to somebody else.
Yeah.
The amazing thing to me is it doesn't matter if I'm talking to an American, to somebody from India, to somebody from Africa or Australia, where we are located, and even our ages, because I've interviewed grandparents, I interview lots of parents. Since I'm a parent myself, I know a lot of parents, but also heart warriors like you and my son, which is really, really exciting to me. I never would have imagined when my son was diagnosed that just 2 decades later, I would be interviewing
Mm-hmm.
people who had lived through what my son had lived through,
Mm-hmm.
and could talk about it, so
Mm.
that has been really exciting. So I think the thing that's most interesting to me is how it doesn't matter what our age is, it doesn't matter where we live, our socioeconomic status, our educational level, we all go through something very similar, and it's
Mm.
transformative, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. Yeah. Regardless of if you have a heart condition or not, or maybe you have a different diagnosis, or, yeah, we've just all learned from our experiences and we all come out of it and then we're able to talk to each other and be like, oh, you've experienced that too, but we have totally different backgrounds and culture
Yeah,
and yeah.
right, right. And what I love is that we find things beyond the heart condition to talk about to make us friends.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And just having survived something as difficult and, let's face it, traumatizing as
Mm-hmm.
open heart surgery, it transforms us into a better version of ourselves.
Yeah. So, out of the many things that doctors and patients need to know about CHD, you've interviewed so many people that is there one thing or a couple of things that you would say is the most important to doctors and patients to know about CHD?
Well, for doctors, I think Alexander is a testament to the fact that you can't give up on these kids. And the interesting thing is that after Alex's doctor saw how well he did, he encouraged me to write that first book, Hypoplastic Left Heart Syndrome, a handbook for parents. And
Mm-hmm.
he told me that he had asked nurses to write something like that so he would have something to give to his patients. And so I asked him if he would write the foreword to my
Oh,
book.
he
He
did?
did. He did. He was so sweet. And he wrote the foreword and he agreed with everything I said in the book, except where I said that I felt compassionate care should not be an option.
Mm.
Well, shortly after I published my first book, he became a father.
Mm.
And so when it came time for me to revise the book, I asked him if he wanted to make any changes, and he said yes. If he wanted to reverse his stance on that, because now that he was a parent himself, he understood why I couldn't give up on Alex.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't know that. That's so wonderful that he had that experience to see, okay, I see what my patients are talking about, and I want to edit that forward.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
It meant so much to me that he could understand from my perspective now why we couldn't give up on Alex. And I asked a doctor once, why is it that compassionate care is still offered as an option? And he said, because even though we are having much greater success operating on these kids with HLHS, there's still so many of them who don't survive that first
Mm.
surgery. And so that's why they have to offer that as an option.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
I know that there are some parents who feel like they just couldn't handle that. Unlike me, I had one child. There are other families who have a baby with HLHS and maybe they have 4 or 5 children. And how do you leave all of those other children behind? I mean, it's not easy.
The effort that it takes to be there not only as a parent, but as a caregiver for someone with CHD is a lot of effort.
It
It's
is. It's
exhausting.
enormous. Hmm.
How did you not that you like don't love your child and want to be there for them, but some days it's just like, oh my gosh, especially when they're young and going through the surgeries and you get to communicate with all the doctors. How did you cope with everything that was going on? Did you have like resources available to you? I know it was like 1994, 5-ish. Did you have a support system that you like built around yourself? How did you cope, basically?
That's a really good question, Margaret. You're right. It was 1994 when Alexander was born, and the internet, I didn't even have internet back then.
Mm.
It was not a common thing. I was at a hospital 3 hours away from where I lived
Mm-hmm.
for Alex's surgery, and my parents lived in that town, but otherwise I didn't really know anybody. The interesting thing was here the surgeon and the cardiologist were telling us, oh, this is really, really rare. But when Alex was having his surgery, there were 3 other HLHS babies in the hospital at the same time. So one of them was an infant whose mother found out in utero that her baby would have HLHS. Another mother was from Fort Hood, and her baby was not really a baby. He was 2 years old. He was having his Fontan. And
Mm-hmm.
then another baby came in after Alex had his surgery. He had had the Norwood procedure, which is the first of 3 surgeries that the HLHS babies had back in 1994. Now there are other surgeries that are offered, but back then that was it. His Norwood had failed, and he was in congestive heart failure, and they told him his only other option was a heart transplant. And so before Alex was discharged, this baby had gotten a brand new heart.
Wow.
So I met these 3 mothers of these little children, and that became my support group. The only way that we could do it, Margaret, way back when, was by phone. And we didn't have cell phones back then
Mm.
like what we do now. And so to call any of these people was a long distance phone call, and that was expensive.
Mm. Yep.
So I couldn't do it, all the time, but we did keep in touch. And then when Alex was 2, then I got internet. And that's when I started to really come to know a lot more people in the congenital heart defect community through
Yeah.
that. And then I also started a support group in Austin, which is only an hour away from where I live. And I got to meet a lot more people that way as
Yeah.
well.
So it sounds like your method of coping is really building a community around yourself of people who know what you've been through and to be able to call on them and be like, hey, I need some help today. Or, I need someone just to listen and hear me out while I verbal vomit.
No, I wish I could say I was like that.
Oh,
Remember,
no.
I'm a real introvert. I did help form that support group, but
Mm.
not for that. That was not, I know that sounds kind of weird, right? My best way of coping, Margaret, is writing,
Okay.
journaling, writing my books. Yeah, through the power of writing. That has been when I first started as a heart mom. The writing is what helped to get me through. But I'll be honest with you, Margaret. I went through a very dark time for a while,
Mm-hmm.
and I was not coping very well.
Mm.
Like I told you, when Alex was first in the hospital, there were those other children. There was Christina, there was Joshua, and there was Nicholas. And Alex made 4. Well, what I didn't tell you was first, the doctors told us that Alex only had a 5% chance to survive his surgery.
Mm.
But then, to make things even more dismal, they said, well, he's probably going to need 3 open heart surgeries. And even if he survives his first surgery, which they were not hopeful at all that he would, they said he only has a 25% chance of making it to the age of 5.
Wow.
That 3 out of 4 babies with HLHS, now mind you, this was the 90s,
Right.
that only 1 out of 4 would make it, that 3 out of 4 were not going to make it. I was kind of defiant and maybe a little bit in denial that that was the
Mm.
case. And then 16 months later, we lost Christina, and then
Mm.
we lost Nicholas.
Mm.
And that was really, really hard.
Yeah.
To lose half of my support group,
Right.
that
Right.
was really, really hard, Margaret. So I went into a depression because of that. And I got sick and was having a lot of trouble getting better. So I went to see my doctor and to get yet another prescription to try and get over my illness. And I said to the doctor, now mind you, I go to Scott and White Hospital in Temple, which is a teaching hospital. So a lot of our doctors are very young. And so this guy looked like Doogie Howser. He was just a really young guy, probably fresh out of college, or so it seemed. So I said to him, do you think the reason why I'm sick and I can't seem to get better is because I'm depressed? And he was, at this time, again, back in the 90s where they had physical charts, writing down notes on my chart.
Right.
And so he stops his writing for a moment and he looks up and he goes, oh, why are you depressed? And I said, well, my son has a heart defect and 2 out of the 4 children that were in the hospital together have passed away. And he stopped and he looked out the window and seemed to consider what I was saying. And then he said, you know, I think you should take a walk every day. And I said, excuse me? He said, yeah, I think if you took a walk every day, that would really be good for you. Well, Margaret, I left that room and I was not a happy camper.
Yeah. He didn't really ask, like, what do you do to relieve your stress? Like, what brings you joy? And he just kind of blanketedly assumed going outside would be good.
Yeah, I just think he didn't really hear me. You know, he heard my words. I think it was overwhelming to a young doctor like that. I think he was out of his element. He didn't know what to say.
Yeah, that's true.
In addition to all the other things that I've told you about myself, what you don't know is that I used to be a teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing. And so I have no poker face. Everybody can read everything on my face. So I was walking out of the room and I was walking down the hallway past the library that they had for parents. And I had donated copies of my book to this library. So I knew the librarian and she took one look at my face and she said, Anna, what's going on? What happened? And I was livid. I was furious. I was like, well, this doctor, he thinks that taking a walk every day is going to solve my problems. I just let loose and told her how upset I was. And I couldn't believe we had lost Christina. We had lost Nicholas. I was so afraid we were going to lose Alex or lose Joshua. And my heart was aching for Patsy and my heart was aching for Shelley. And there was nothing I could do for them. And she listened to me and was such an angel. And she said, you know, I know exactly who you need to talk to. And I said, really? She said, I have a friend. Would you go down and talk to her if she's available? And I said, okay. So she made a quick phone call and she said, she's available. She wants you to come down right now. And I said, who is this? And she said, she's a chaplain. And I said, oh, I don't know. She said, no. It's not like she's going to proselytize or anything. She knows. She'll understand. She'll be able to help you. So I thought at this point, what have I got to lose? So I walked down to the room and I talked to the chaplain and shared my story. And she said, well, what's the name of your child's heart defect? And I'm thinking, this is a hospital chaplain where they don't do open heart surgery. She's not going to know this. And I said, oh, it's a really rare disease. And she said, no. She said, please tell me, what is it? So I said, hypoplastic left heart syndrome. And she said, oh my goodness. Margaret, she had this light in her eyes. She had this expression on her face that I realized she knew what I was talking about. She said, my best friend's child had HLHS.
Oh my gosh. And how old was that child?
The child had passed away. But she said, but I think my friend could help you.
Yeah.
And so she put me in touch with Jan Heckman, who I'm still friends with today. We're in a book club together.
Yeah.
So we still see each other once every 6 weeks. And Jan really did help me because I was going through such a depression that I needed to talk to somebody who really understood and who could let me know that even if Alex died, which I never wanted to think about, but even if
Sure.
he did, that I could still be there for Joey and I
Yeah.
could still survive, because my heart ached so much
Mm.
that I really believed, Margaret, that if Alex died, that I would die. I really believed I would die of a broken heart.
Yeah.
And Jan taught me that I could survive and that
Mm.
Joey and Frank would need me and that I would have to find the strength to survive even if my baby didn't.
Yeah. So she helped you find that strength.
She did. She shared her story and we became friends. And the chaplain was also exactly the person I needed to meet. That librarian was totally correct. She invited me to attend some support group meetings for the bereaved. And I didn't think that they would accept me because my baby hadn't died, but she assured me that they would be welcoming. And so at the very first meeting that I went to, everybody went around a room, and this was for people who had lost people of all ages. It wasn't
Mm.
just parents who had lost children. And so it got to me, and I thought I hadn't lost anybody, but I explained that we had lost Christina and we had lost Nicholas, and that I was really brokenhearted about it. And I didn't know if I really belonged there because I wasn't like all of the rest of them. And they were so loving and
Mm.
so accepting, and they told me I was in the right place, and they gave me hugs, which
Yeah.
I really needed at that time. You know, I needed to feel that my grief and my pain was okay. It was okay to feel that way, and that even though I hadn't lost my child physically, that they were my children. I had, you know, kind of adopted them as my children.
Right.
And that's what it is to be a heart mom. You know, you just take into your heart all these other heart warriors and the heart parents and the grandparents. They become your community. They become like your family.
Yeah.
And that's why sometimes doing a podcast is hard.
Mm.
You know, it's really hard to talk to parents who have lost children and grandparents who have lost grandchildren. I'm a grandmother now.
Yeah.
It's almost inconceivable to think that I could lose my grandchild. You know, that
Right.
she could die before I die. That doesn't seem like the natural order of things.
Right.
But the joy of doing a podcast is that I know now that even if somebody comes on my show and that's what's happened to them, I know they can survive. I know that that baby, no matter how long or how short a time they were here on this earth, they had a mission, they had a purpose,
Yeah.
and that by talking together, we can find what that is,
Yeah.
and we can share their legacy.
Yeah. You touched upon my next question, which is sometimes doing what we do, talking and sharing other people's stories on our channel or our, podcast can be absolutely overwhelming because, and I think I kind of sense it as to who you are because I'm very similar. We take in what we hear and we kind of sit with it and hold it close to us. And other people's burdens basically become partially our own. How are you able to kind of separate that? Or do you not? Are you just kind of like, okay, I've learned someone else's story and it's okay that their story was very difficult, but it's not my life? Like, how do you cope with the interviewing other people that have gone through very difficult times?
That's a good question. It is very hard sometimes, especially when I'm not a millionaire. I
Yeah.
can't just write a check for $1 million to provide surgery for somebody who's in Africa when there's no hospital in Africa to help them.
Right.
That's heartbreaking to know that there are kids out there I can't help.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the cool things about podcasting, as long as I've been doing it, is that I have come to know people all over the world. And I've become a connector.
Mm.
Have you read the book, The Tipping Point?
I have heard of it and I have not read it.
It's a good read. The first 50 pages, skim over. They're just, for whatever reason, I had a real hard time getting into the book. But once I got past that first 50 pages, it got so much easier. And then it was completely engrossing. In The Tipping Point, he talks about people being different kinds of people. And one of the types of people that he mentioned was a connector.
Mm.
And I really understand that now because I feel like I am a connector. I'll tell you my favorite story of being a connector. And this is why I feel it's so important what we're doing. And for us to keep our ears and our eyes open and to be open to helping other people, even if you don't have $1 million that you can give away to give somebody surgery.
Right.
So I had been doing this for a while. And when I first was doing it, I would sometimes get letters from people who said, oh, my baby needs this, my baby needs that. Would you write me a check for this or that? And I, of course, didn't have enough money to do all of that. So then I kind of hated to open mail sometimes because a lot of it was people asking me for money. Then I got this email from this woman in Africa. And she said, hello, I found you on the internet and I'm wondering if you can help me. And I thought, oh no, is this going to be another one of those letters? But I always read them anyway, just in case there is something I could do. And as I started to read into the letter, this mother was telling me she was a single mother. She lived in Africa. She only had one child. Her child was 10 years old, and a cardiologist just told her if her son did not have surgery soon, he would die. And, of course, my heart starts to break, but I'm thinking, this kid's in Africa. What can I do? And then she said, please see attached the letter from the cardiologist saying that my son needs surgery. And she also attached another letter, which had the child's complete diagnosis and information about the doctor, which was unusual. Most of the time when people wrote to me, I wondered if I was being scammed. But this woman was genuine. She obviously really did have a child. The child really did need surgery. I looked at the letter. Everything looked legit. And so it just so happened that I had met two gentlemen because of my podcast from Africa. And one of the gentlemen was a philanthropist who was touched, not personally. He didn't have a child with a heart defect, but he knew some people. And he was just such a good-hearted man that he started working with this nonprofit to help children in Africa because there's no hospital in Africa serving those children. Yeah. The other person was a father who had been personally touched. His child had been born with a heart defect. And so I reached out to these two gentlemen and I said, this mother wrote to me, her son has to have surgery. Is there anything you can do? And Fareed Matthews made it his mission to help this child. He wrote letter after letter after letter. And it looked like we had, the boy's name was Ellis. So it looked like we had a surgeon who was going to operate on Elvis, but then we couldn't get transportation. Like I said, there were no hospitals in Africa. The child had to go to, I want to say Israel. And then there was a doctor in Turkey who was going to take him. And then something happened and that fell through. And then finally, Heart Gift in Dallas, Texas, took on Elvis's case and flew Elvis from Africa to Dallas. Well, I live in Central Texas.
Yeah.
I drove to Dallas. I got to meet his mother. I got to meet Elvis.
Aww.
And he got his life-saving surgery.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. That's just a remarkable story.
So that's made everything worth it.
Yeah.
We saved Elvis, Margaret.
Right, like helping, being a connector, connecting people. That's
Yeah, I
so
didn't
great.
do it. None of my money went into this, but just reaching out. And it was for Reed Matthews, who would not give up.
Mm,
And he just was amazing. We just lost Fareed to COVID. But he saved this little boy, and
mm,
he will forever be a champion in my eyes. He
yeah.
was an amazing man, and I hope his family hears this and knows what an impact he made, because he was a really good man. And I know that his wife is going to continue his mission and help children in Africa to get the surgery that they need. But
That's
he,
wonderful.
he's an amazing man. It's hard what we do. We're
Yeah.
facing life and death every single day. You even more so than me, being a heart warrior yourself. But because of the people that we're in touch with, Margaret,
Mm,
every day we're reminded that life is fleeting and everything can change literally in a heartbeat.
mm,
So I think it's our mission, Margaret, to do as much good as we can in this world, to bring as much joy as we can to the people that we know.
yeah.
And if we're lucky, we may even get a chance to save Elvis.
Yeah. That is a beautiful story. What was the name of the organization that he started in Africa?
Reed Matthews started the organization called Brave Little Hearts, South Africa.
Okay, okay,
Brave Little Hearts, South Africa.
okay.
And they do have a Facebook page. They're
Mm-hmm.
taking donations. They're working as hard as they can to get surgery for kids.
To help those with going through this very not easy venture, what would you like to share with the CHD community in general? Is there any message that you would like to share?
Yes, I would. First of all, you're not alone. That's my tagline in my podcast. And that's because when I was going through being a heart mom at the very beginning, I felt very isolated. I felt very alone. Knowing that you're not alone is really, really helpful.
Yeah.
Really helps when you have people that you can talk to who really understand what you're going through. But I think then, aside from knowing that you're not alone, the next and probably the most important thing to know is that this is a lifelong condition.
Mm-hmm.
I've had so many older CHD warriors, heart warriors, come on my program,
Mm-hmm.
and their parents were told when they had their surgery that they were fixed.
Mm.
And they grew up thinking, I'm fixed. I'm not going to need anything else. And it's really easy to become complacent and not, and I don't even know if I should say become complacent. You want to be normal. You don't want to have to see the cardiologist. You don't want to have to go on that treadmill and take that stress test. You don't want to think that anything is wrong with you, especially when you feel good.
Right.
Everybody would like to think that you're fixed, especially the heart warrior himself or herself, I'm sure. But unfortunately, you're not.
Mm-hmm.
For the most part. I mean, maybe there are a couple of heart defects. My granddaughter was born with a heart murmur.
Mm.
And so she obviously had a hole in her heart somewhere, but it was small enough that she's 2 years old now and they don't hear it anymore. So they feel certain that it has completely closed up. In that case, yeah, you are fixed. But for the most part, especially the heart warriors who are born with critical congenital heart defects that required surgery in that first year of life,
Yeah.
it's something that you have to be aware of for the rest of your life.
Yeah. Yep. I had a recent situation, and I just wanted to shut down and pretend that I didn't need to go see the cardiologist. And I was like, no, I have to go. And yeah, it's not fun all the time.
No, it's not. It's not fun. It's not fun, first of all, knowing that there, there this is. For me as a heart mom, I was always waiting for that other shoe to drop.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's a horrible way to live. You're kind of always on hold.
And it's the same thing, well, at least for me as a heart patient, that's what I've been waiting for. The other shoe to drop, the next problem to arise.
Right.
Yeah.
I think what I've learned as a heart mom is that it does get better.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because before I talked to you just a little while ago, I was on the phone with a young heart mom whose little one just had his Fontan. Mm-hmm. And she had been worried about his oxygen saturation level, and we were talking about that. And I remember when Alex was her son's age, and we were still recovering from the Fontan. And I remember wondering, is there ever going to be a day where I wake up and that's not the first thing I think about, and it's not the last thing I think about before I fall asleep? And I really doubted that that was going to happen. I was kind of thinking, okay, this is my life for the rest of my life. The first and last thing I think about are going to be my son's heart defect. And I can honestly tell you, Margaret, that that's not the case. That there does come a time when you wake up and you're thinking about your trip to the zoo, or you're thinking about, I don't know, going grocery shopping, just normal stuff. And the first and last thought are not about your child's heart defect. So it does get better. Yeah. And even as a heart warrior, there are going to be days, months, possibly years, where your heart defect is the central focus of your life, because it has to be for whatever reason. But then you're going to have times when it's not. And those are the times you really, really want to celebrate.
Yeah. Cherish those moments. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm so happy that, you've found a point in your life where that, first thing that you're thinking of in the morning is not the O2 saturation, and you're giving so much hope to the CHD community with all that you do. So thank you so much for doing that. This has been really wonderful to chat with you.
Well, thank you, Margaret. I so enjoyed having you on my program, and I so enjoyed being a guest on your program.